The NATO action in Serbia is in breach of its own charter, outside the recognized parameters of international law, and entirely without reference to the United Nations. I shall argue that it is a bandit action, committed with no serious consideration of the consequences, ill-judged, ill-thought, miscalculated, an act of deplorable machismo. The language used to justify the NATO action is alarming.
Ending this tragedy is a moral imperative.
I believe we are fighting for the values of civilization here.
We are a superior power, and we must win this conflict with whatever it takes.
We're acting clearly within a basis in international law. We do not break the law.
The Geneva Conventions Act states that civilians shall not be the object of an attack unless they take a direct part in hostilities. How can you then describe the killing of civilians in the Belgrade TV station as anything else than an act of murder?
I deny and refute that absolutely, completely. Mr. Pinter's obviously got a new occupation now, but I know his views. The fact is that many of these targets are indeed the brains behind the brutality going on in Kosovo today, part and parcel of the apparatus that is driving this ethnic genocide that is going on inside this part of the former Yugoslavia.
I think the argument that NATO is justified in going in to stop genocide, I understand it, but I don't think that genocide had begun in Kosovo before the bombing. And even since then, the Kosovans have been driven out of Kosovo, but they haven't all been killed. That was not the problem.
The procedures and authority of the United Nations were ignored.
The Security Council has primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. And this is explicitly acknowledged in the North Atlantic Treaty. Therefore, the Council should be involved in any decision to resort to force.
Well, strictly speaking, NATO's bombing of Serbia is contrary to the United Nations Charter, which we've signed. It involves the bombing of a fellow member of the United Nations without the authority of the United Nations, and not because that country has attacked another country, but because what it's doing inside its own borders.
Is NATO being honest in its conduct of the war? This is what was said by NATO leaders and spokesmen about the air attacks on the Kosovo refugee convoys.
NATO aircraft were engaged in Kosovo this afternoon against military vehicles. I have no further information at the moment on this incident. Naturally, we're checking it out, we're investigating. We will try, of course, to establish all of the facts. As soon as we've established the facts, I will report back to you, but I have nothing further to add at the present time. I have no indication at the present time that NATO was responsible for any other damage to a civilian vehicle than the incident Novacevic described to you yesterday.
After the convoy was hit, military people got out and attacked civilians. He believes that there may be some imagery of that, and he is trying to get it now, but he doesn't know for a fact that he does have it.
But I have to tell you, if anyone thinks that this is a reason for changing our mission, then the United States will never be able to bring military power to bear again, because there is no such thing as flying airplanes this fast, dropping weapons this powerful, dealing with an enemy this pervasive, who is willing to use people as human shields and never have this sort of tragic thing happen.
Some of those who were in the convoy have now crossed the border. Their accounts continue to cloud the picture. They also say there were no Serb units near them when they were attacked. Brian Hanrahan, BBC News.
There were several days' delay in showing us the video image of the attack on the convoy. At first, NATO said that there were 2 attacks. The day after, they amended that to say there was only 1 attack. Several days later, the American Brigadier General turned up and said no, there were actually 2 attacks. That was a pure exercise in news management. When that video was shown, an audible murmur went around the press conference, to the extent, that's a tractor. That came in the middle of a 40-minute, lavishly illustrated briefing devoted to that one topic. In other words, it came with a vast amount of material to contextualise it. I suspect that if we'd been shown that video the day after the attack, on its own, without the American Brigadier General, without the lavishly composed graphics, then its PR impact would have been much more negative for NATO. Reporters are sent to Brussels to report on the war, not to help NATO. I mean, for example, it's very easy to discern a sort of slippage of journalistic technique into saying that anything which emanates from NATO is confirmed. NATO confirms things. Authorities in Belgrade only ever claim things.
NATO waited nearly a week to show cockpit videos that are usually shown the following day on TV. What does that tell us? We are being spun and managed, kept on message with the desperate assertion that this is a replay of the Holocaust and Milosevic is Adolf Hitler. The trains onto which ethnic Albanians were forced did not lead to gas chambers, but to Macedonia. I cannot see how you can compare ethnic cleansing, which is essentially the expulsion of a people from a given area, with the extermination of a race. I ask you to look more closely at everything that is being said, or not said. The government and NATO spokesmen are responsible for a catalogue of half-truths and distortions, with unquestioning journalists at press briefings, often simply acting as audio typists.
That we do not drop bombs and risk collateral damage and injury to civilians who might be in the area.
The station is right in the middle of a heavily populated area in the center of Belgrade. The rescue services were on hand in a matter of minutes, trying to find survivors in the rubble.
Not even the most brazen spokesman could have pretended that the Belgrade TV station, which transmits around the clock, would be empty.
These civilians had no reason to expect to die, especially because NATO spokesman Jamie Shea had assured the International Federation of Journalists days before that the TV station would not be attacked.
The NATO alliance decided to bomb the Serbian TV station because it realized that the Serbian TV station would from time to time reveal information that NATO didn't want revealed. NATO didn't want to reveal that it had bombed the civilian convoy, and left to itself would never have revealed it until the war was over. But they were forced to admit to the bombing of that civilian convoy because Serbian TV said that it had happened and then took Western reporters in a bus to show them the results of it.
We hear no regret by NATO for these people who were told they would be safe. But when a Serbian newspaperman and critic of Milosevic was shot down in the street, it was rightly described in the West as a brutal act of suppression. Both are ugly murders of human beings who propagate words or images that somebody else doesn't like. Now let us get to the crux of the media war, the refugees.
There was plenty of evidence that NATO bombing would lead to mass expulsions of Kosovo Albanians by Serbian forces.
Once the war started, the flood of refugees was inevitable. When bombs fall, people tend to run away. Whether they were fleeing NATO bombs or Serb guns, their images were bound to produce an enormous impact on public opinion in the West. The direct correlation between the pitiful flood of televisual victims and increasing support for NATO bombing provides a convenient justification for why we bomb. The majority were against the bombing until these pictures were shown. Some of you will say it doesn't matter that the media are frequently being manipulated as shamelessly, though not as crudely, by NATO as by Milosevic's regime. You're enraged by his ethnic cleansing and proclaim it a just and legitimate war because we have the duty to intervene. We can only intervene, of course, if we have the moral authority ourselves to do so. What is moral authority? Where does it come from? How do you achieve it? Who bestows it upon you? How do you persuade others that you possess it? You don't. You don't have to bother. What you have is power. Bombs and power. And that's your moral authority.
I believe we are fighting for the values of civilization.
The US moral position is in fact highly ambiguous. When human rights groups discovered US jets were being used by the Turkish Air Force to bomb Kurdish villages within its own territory, the Clinton administration found ways to evade laws requiring suspension of arms deliveries. 1.4 million Kurds fled Turkish repression from 1990 to 1994, yet Turkey is invited to the top table at NATO's birthday party. The US denied that genocide, 800,000 dead, was taking place in Rwanda because it wasn't in the interest of the USA to be part of a United Nations intervention force. But it calls the Serbian ethnic cleansing genocide because it was politically expedient to do so. Or so it thought. Who is Bill Clinton, a man of, at best, highly questionable moral sensibility, to say when, how, and where we should intervene, when morally repugnant regimes supported by the Western powers continue to exist? The logical consequence of Tony Blair's progressive military action must be a permanent state of war, in which Britain and NATO must keep swimming like supposedly humanitarian sharks, gobbling up repressive little minnows as and when they decree. It would have to be a permanent state of war, for in order to pursue a humanitarian policy with any consistency, intervention must be invoked in all relevant cases against a traditional ally like Turkey, or a big bad monster like China. For otherwise, the get tough ethical policy is mere rhetoric, a selective application of moralistic violence.
We are a superior power, and we must win this conflict with whatever it takes.
1, 0, missile away.
Britain's own cynicism is shown in its true attitude towards admitting Kosovo-Albanian refugees in recent court actions and the asylum bill. So far, Britain has taken in some 300 ethnic Albanians. In 1 month, Germany has taken 10,000. Actions speak louder than words.
The answer to what is happening is to intensify the attacks. It is to get in and to hit Milosevic and his murderous thugs very, very hard, and it is what we intend to do.
Under the rhetoric, Blair's real character has become clear. There's nothing like a missile. There's nothing like power. It was really worth waiting for.
Unlike the previous government, Labour concurs with the Clinton administration foreign policy over former Yugoslavia, so we need to understand exactly what the US record is.
These refugees are not Albanians. They are Serbs. Over 2,500 of them were killed or went missing. Until the recent disaster in Kosovo, this was the greatest single act of displacement and ethnic cleansing in all the Yugoslav wars.
We did not think that that kind of an attack could do anything other than create a lot of refugees and cause a humanitarian problem. On the other hand, it always had the prospect of simplifying matters.
The operation was carried out by officers trained by MPRI, an organization of US Army veteran commanders, and was armed with a great deal of US weaponry in an attack of which the US had full knowledge. Around 200,000 Serbs fled, often bombarded by Croatian forces. Although their rebel regime had expelled ethnic Croatians, many of these Serb families had lived there as a majority for hundreds of years. Yet their departure had the prospect of simplifying matters for the Clinton administration and creating convenient, ethnically pure maps without committing US ground forces. Richard Holbrooke frequently claims to act with high moral purpose in his missions to former Yugoslavia, yet in his own memoirs, he admits to egging on these military assaults, telling the Croatians to hurry up before the Serbs regroup, and merely rebuking the Croatian leader during one of their cozy chats for the ethnic cleansing being carried out by his forces. The reason the world paid little attention to these atrocities was simple. On the very day Croatia began its attack and ethnic cleansing, the then US ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, timed her release to the world of the images of mass graves of Muslims killed by the Serbs at Srebrenica. These were taken weeks before by US spy satellites, but the Clinton administration seems to have cynically held back news of one atrocity, committed by the demon Serbs, to mask that of another, being carried out that very day by the friendly Croats. Richard Holbrooke boasted how a few weeks later he circumvented the rule of the United Nations to begin bombing the Bosnian Serbs. He needed direct authority from the United Nations, but the Secretary General did not see eye to eye on US policy in Bosnia. Fortunately, Secretary General Boutros Ghali was unreachable on a commercial aircraft. So Madeleine Albright dealt instead with his best deputy, Kofi Annan. Annan won the job as next Secretary General that day. That was 1995. Today, the Clinton administration doesn't bother ringing up Kofi Annan or anyone else in the UN. They just issue directives to NATO with Tony Blair acting not so much the puppet as the pilot fish, swimming earnestly ahead for bombs and missiles, whether the target is Iraq or Yugoslavia. Indeed, whichever country is required to detract from the president's sexual misadventures or provide a raison d'etre for NATO on its 50th birthday.
Honorable William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States of America.
In the 10 years before the West began negotiating with the hardline KLA, and despite the fact that war was often raging in other parts of former Yugoslavia, Kosovo saw tension, but little bloodshed. In fact, a comparable amount of people died in political violence there as during the same period in Northern Ireland. At once the KLA began their uprising, soon earning the approval of the 19 democratic nations, not forgetting Turkey. 2,000 died in 1 year of Kosovo violence.
I think the KLA's modus of operation before this crisis emerged into the mind of the Western public was a classic terrorist-stroke partisan operation. They wanted to gain power. They had contempt for the democratic route, which admittedly wasn't easy to follow, to put it mildly, in Kosovo. But their methods were cynical and ruthless. They attacked not only Serb policemen and officials, but civilians, and also Albanians they didn't like.
The KLA began a standard guerrilla struggle. Milosevic responded with standard counter-insurgency, though less vehemently than nearby Turkey did with its Kurds, while America turned a blind eye. I believe the Clinton administration was determined to provoke a crisis, to play out an endgame. They forced the combatants in what was still a relatively low-intensity conflict to France for peace talks, where both sides were literally told to sign or else.
The Serbian delegation was on one floor and the Kosovar delegation on another floor. I would like to emphasize that during this process, there was no real contact between the Serbian and the Kosovar delegation. In other words, there were no negotiations. Now, what happened in that castle was that they were presented with a document, and that document was made by the so-called international community, which in this case means essentially State Department, Washington. And it had been announced in advance that if the combination was no from Serbia and yes from the Kosovars, then the result would be bombing. So it was a diktat. But they got the no-yes combination, and it had been announced in advance that that would trigger the bombing, so that the NATO forces could say, we didn't want to bomb you, you asked for it, by producing that no-yes combination. Now that's a cowardly, bastardly technique, I would say. Well, I would even go a little bit further. I would say it has fascist connotations.
In a little-noticed annex to the agreement, NATO insisted that its forces should be allowed to have freedom of movement throughout the whole of Yugoslavia, not just in Kosovo. And there was no real constraint over what sort of forces there would be and, to a great extent, what their activities would be.
If you're a dictator, the prime minister of a democratic country, or even Mrs. Thatcher, and your sovereign territory is going to be occupied, you might as well resist, or your time in power is over. The only possible inducement to Milosevic was that the province, though autonomous, would still technically be under Yugoslav sovereignty.
There was a very cynical aspect to the build-up to this crisis, the deliberate provocation of reprisals by the KLA. And now, as we've seen, they've got all the reprisals and more than they could ever have wanted. But this aspect has been neglected in the press, that it wasn't simply unprovoked and meaningless racial violence on the part of the Serbs, though we've now seen quite a lot of that too, but a complex struggle for power over Kosovo in which the lives of ordinary Kosovo Albanians and others were really treated as pawns.
Before staging a surgical strike using smart clinical bombs, we must follow the Hippocratic principle. First, do no harm to the patient. Otherwise, choose another approach.
But the moment that we said, OK, we're going to bomb, we had to, for their safety, we had to take out the OSCE observers. The moment that happened, all the United Nations agencies said, if they're off, we are off. Now, once they had withdrawn, there was no one to witness what was happening, no one to see who was burning the villages, no one to see who was separating men from families, no one to see who was raping the women.
By the time the West swung in behind hardline KLA separatists, this support only helped to harden the Serbian stance and further sideline moderates like Rugova from the Albanian people. The situation deteriorated for all concerned.
The 5th of April, Pentagon announced that when all the Kosovars are out, they could do carpet bombing of Kosovo. Now, how do you react when you hear that one? Well, if you are a Kosovar, you would try to get out as quickly as possible. If you are a Serb, you might like to close the border in order to keep a sufficient amount of Kosovars in order to prevent the carpet bombing. And the Serbs seem to be saying now that we are prepared to have 600,000 Albanians, Kosovars, within Kosovo. So that would be enough to stave off the carpet bombing, and at the same time low enough, according to Serbian calculation, to get a better demographic balance. Still another reason, should not underestimate that sooner or later the relationship between KLA and NATO may become less cozy. When the KLA discovers for full that the NATO strategy takes the fruits of their endeavors away from them. This is not the independent Kosovo that they've been dreaming about. It's a disaster zone destroyed by the people who presumably are there to help them. And they might say, let's get out, let us sign up as refugees and go somewhere else.
This war was begun, we were told, to achieve the Wamwili agreement and prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Since that has failed, what is now its justification?
The bombing has not benefited one jot the Kosovos. Without a shadow of doubt, as an initial aim, it failed, because we ended up with 800,000 refugees outside, and the bombing, we are told, was done for the benefit of the population of Kosovo.
They haven't delivered in the sense of it being a humanitarian initiative. If it's making Kosovo safe for people to go back, it's also making it a total wasteland. What will they go back to? And what are the knock-on effects? Problems lead to problems.
Clearly, what has happened over the last 5 weeks or so has radicalized Kosovo Albanians and Albanians in general. But some of them privately will admit that the KLA's activities and the terrible consequences have proved the wisdom of Ibrahim Rugova's argument that in a place like Kosovo, even though the Albanians made up the vast majority of the population, open revolt against the Yugoslav state could only produce catastrophe.
Is the solution now a land war to bring the ethnic Albanians home?
We have to remember that although hundreds of thousands of people have fled from Kosovo, there are still hundreds of thousands of people there. And of course there are millions of people in the rest of Yugoslavia. A land war will involve terrible destruction. When the Allied tanks move in and so on, they will, of course, to protect themselves, have to blow up buildings which might hide snipers, might hide artillery or whatever, but might also hide cowering civilians, ordinary people. If you look at any war, it's when the fighting goes in on the ground that the toll in human life, particularly collateral human life, shoots up. So I don't think we should just think about our own soldiers' lives, but also the civilians, the very people we may want to protect.
Only 2 years ago, hundreds of thousands of young people were out on the streets against Milosevic. Our blundering policy of bombing now finds them linking hands on bridges, waiting to be hit. The question of a NATO land force going in to liberate Kosovo is indeed now being discussed. But by the time a NATO land force will have finished its work, there will be nothing left to liberate. The 19 democratic nations keep widening the target list. But what are they actually aiming at? The crazed logic of escalation without knowing where we are going, on the ground or in the air, must surely make us stop and consider if we are acting in a right or in a civilized way.
But if the refugees are going to have any chance of going home, the sooner the better. After all, many of them are farmers. As the seasons go on, they are going to become destitute. They won't be able to return to their farms at all to plant their crops, to harvest them. And they will become like the great exoduses of recent history, the Palestinians, whatever, simply fixed in refugee camps. And they, to some extent, won't want to go home. They won't feel secure to go home and so on. Every week that goes by makes it less likely that people will go home.
It isn't simply bombing or not bombing, but what are our options in between? And how do we go into the next century by fine-tuning possibilities to enable social and political change without just mass destruction and using up our arsenals from an old way. We've brought Cold War logic and Cold War force into a post-Cold War situation.
I think the only possible way now to get out of this mess and to save the Kosovars from the tragedy they're suffering is to involve the Russians in a major way in a negotiation with Milosevic, and the objective would be to give as much of Kosovo the status of a United Nations protectorate in which Russian and NATO and perhaps neutral forces would all be protecting them against the possibility of another attack by the Serbs.
I believe that we are fighting not to restore the Kosovo Albanians to their homeland, but finally, simply to restore the credibility of NATO on its forlorn 50th birthday.
But when we fight to prevail.
Our confidence in our own peace and security depends on the credibility of NATO.
Hit Milosevic and his murderous thugs very, very hard.
Our plan is to persist until we prevail.
Prevail in what? This rhetoric is about avoiding humiliation. We are told we have to go on and on, but it is not too late to achieve a solution through the UN or Russia or both. Tony Blair has led us in a sanctimonious crusade which bestows a sheen of moral purpose, but is fundamentally hollow. None of the things that have been done or that NATO contemplates doing will help the Kosovo Albanians. By none of the accepted definitions can this be seen as a just war. It has no clear legal basis. As to its chances of success, no air campaign has ever won a war without ground intervention. And a land war itself has more chance of destroying Kosovo than of saving it. We must call on our government to stop this war.